Good evening, everyone. Hello from around the UK. It's Trustees Week 2024, and it is so good to be here with our RDA community. Welcome to our Trustees Week online workshop, Elevate Your Group, Building Better Leadership Together. It is Wednesday, the 6th of November, and we're already halfway through Trustees Week. So wherever you are, wherever you're tuned in from, I hope that you are well. We are so happy to have you here and that you have joined us this evening for a fantastic evening of learning and connection. My name is Rachel King, and I am the National Volunteering Manager here at RDA National Office. RDA is, of course, the reason why we're all here, and as part of Trustees Week, we are celebrating our trustees, recognising those who tirelessly work behind the scenes for our wonderful organisation, contributing to the incredible work that goes on through RDA across the UK. This evening, we've got a fantastic workshop lined up for you, but before we kick things off and I introduce our guest facilitator, we've just got a bit of housekeeping to cover. I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge that this session is being recorded, and by continuing to join this meeting, you're consenting to being recorded, which will be available for playback on our YouTube channel. Please do keep yourselves on mute throughout the session so that we can avoid any background noise and interference. Live captions have been enabled, so if you'd like captions for the workshop, you can do so by pressing the More or three dots button at the bottom of your screen and click Captions. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to reach out to a member of the team in the chat box. I've got Amy here with me in the office this evening, supporting with any issues, and she'll be more than happy to help. We are going to have things going on in the chat box and, of course, plenty of opportunity to ask our speaker lots of questions. This is an interactive session and we want you to be involved because the whole point of this session is to be fully interactive and for us to be fully present. The team will be keeping an eye on that chat box, so please do put any thoughts or questions in there. So on that note, it would be really fantastic to know where you're all joining us from around the country and which RDA group or area you're involved in. If you feel comfortable, please do say hello in the chat box, introduce yourself and give a shout out to your local RDA group. It would be great to know what you're hoping to get out of the session this evening, so you also let us know that in the chat box. I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker this evening, Felicia Willow from Willow Consulting. Felicia has 17 years of experience in the charity sector and has led 7 UK charities through periods of change and growth. She is often referred to as the Mary Poppins of the charity sector and brings a wealth of practical experience and solutions to her work as a charity consultant and also as a co-host of For Impact, the charity podcast. I hope you enjoy the session and I will hand over now to Felicia.
Hi, everybody. Happy Trustees Week. What we're going to do is I've got a presentation to talk through. If you've got questions, pop them into the chat. And we've got kind of 3 different modules to get through, some kind of more basic training, looking specifically at recruitment, and then having what I think is a really interesting look at things like diversity and group thinking kind of issues. So lots of different things to get through today, and hopefully it'll be interesting and fun. So I'm going to start sharing my presentation. So you know who I am. I do quite a lot of trustee training, board development, those kind of activities throughout the country. I also do governance reviews for organizations that are really looking to dig deep into what the board is doing and what it can do next. And I'm a lawyer originally by training, so a lot of different connections with this kind of stuff. I've also obviously sat on a number of boards myself as well as a trustee, so I know how difficult the job can be. So what we're doing today, as I said, 3 different modules. We're looking at, firstly, an introduction to charities and the duties of charity trustees. Now, some of you might know some of this stuff already. You might have been to governance training before. It won't take up the majority of what we're doing, but it's just making sure we've all got the same kind of understanding of some of the basics around being a charity trustee and what that means. Then we move on to really looking at trustee recruitment and things like induction as well. So recognizing this is a massive challenge. It's a really difficult thing to do, but there are best practice ways of doing it that we'll talk about in that session. And finally, we're going to look at these questions around group thinking and diverse decision making and the value and challenges that presents. There's been some fantastic books written on the subject in recent years that I've really been enjoying reading. So I'm going to share with you some of the insights that I've learned from those books in recent months. Just starting off with, why do trustees need training? It is Trustee Week. Obviously, there's a lot of trustee training and information going on, but trustees are ultimately accountable to the Charity Commission. They hold the legal responsibility for a charity's performance and success. But more than that, a charity's success really depends on good trustees. I've worked in a lot of organizations in crisis. And what I see as well in crisis situations and difficult situations that I often get called into organizations to help them work through is that sometimes these trustees understanding their role and figuring out how these tensions can exist with other people in an organization can cause many of the problems in a charity world. So really getting that clarity, which might differ organization to organization in some ways. And I believe a good trustee is always learning. I'm certainly still always learning. I'm out here working on charities and I learn new things all the time. So I think it's a really important thing that we keep learning and keep talking about these things. So module 1, this is this introduction session. So what makes a charity different? So as you know, charities are set up for the public benefit, not for individual benefit like your average company. To be a charity, you're registered with the Charity Commission, and of course, you're run by voluntary trustees. There are very rare exceptions in which trustees may be paid, but in the main, the vast majority of trustees for the nearly 200,000 charities we have in this country are entirely voluntary. One of the things that make a charity very different is that they can only do what they are set up to do, or if they can change those things as well, but they're objects. So the objects of a charity set out the entirety of what that charity is allowed to do without getting further permission from the Charity Commission. If you've ever tried to set up a charity, you'll find that is the period of time in which the Charity Commission is most interested in what you're talking about. They will look at those applications very, very carefully because they need to make sure that that charity really will be for the public benefit. One of the biggest differences is the division of the relationship between the payer and the receiver. So if you walk into a shop and you say, I want to buy a chocolate bar, and the shopkeeper gives you a bag of crisps, you can say, give me my pound back, I wanted a chocolate bar, or give me that chocolate bar, I didn't ask for the crisps. In a charity, somebody gives money to the charity and the charity spends money on either the cause or on someone different. And that immediacy and that ability to say, hang on, that's not what I asked for, isn't there. There's a division between the payer and the receiver. And the reality of managing that in practice requires a lot of trust. So there are much higher and more stringent standards to be met by charities. But in recognition of the fact that it is for the public benefit, charities receive tax breaks and other benefits to help them in what they're doing. Charities are regulated by the Charity Commission. Someone in England and Wales, I know some of you in Scotland, you have your own charity regulator up there. This is a government department separate from ministerial influence, and it does have quasi-judicial functions. So when you look at the list of things it can do, it can intervene in charities, it can appoint new trustees, it can dismiss boards, it can take quite aggressive action. In practice, it doesn't often do that. And again, if you think we have nearly 200,000 charities in the UK, it's realistic to think that the vast majority of charities are not going to come across the regulator doing anything particularly active at any point in time. But it is there to have that regulation purpose. It holds trustees accountable, but primarily it does this through the submission of annual reports. So I'm sure if you've all been involved in your charity for more than a year, you'll all have gone through the annual reporting process. And that is a process that really works on the basis of transparency. The Charity Commission doesn't interrogate what you send in the way it would if you were applying to set up a charity. It really just puts up what you've put in onto their website so that everyone can see it. So funders, external donors can check you out, have a look at what you're like, and really it's regulated through that transparency. So one of the things that people often talk about is that charities really just businesses. A lot of people talk about how charities should be more business minded. And I'm actually doing an MBA at the moment because I got so tired of people saying that to me. I wanted to be able to be like, okay, what do you mean? In what way should they be more business minded? And it's been quite an interesting journey, which I won't talk too much about now. But the question is, are they just businesses? Should they be more like businesses? Do they need to be more business minded? But I think it's really important that we differentiate really clearly between businesses and charities because their bottom line is fundamentally different. A business's bottom line is profit, and a charity's bottom line is impact. Now, I often go around saying that we should be called the For Impact sector. That's why my podcast is called For Impact. We're not just the voluntary sector. We're not just the third sector. We're not just the charity sector. We are actually here to make a change, to make a positive change, to make an impact. So that is our bottom line. And while finances are relevant to that, it is not the ultimate line in which we operate. So to make a profit, businesses try to lower expenses and raise prices. But to make impact, charities try to do more good with less money. So it's quite a fundamentally different concept in how we run businesses versus charities. So businesses try to do as little as possible for as much as possible to make profit. Charities try to do as much as possible for as little as possible to have impact. I think these distinctions are really, really important when we're running charities, so we can understand that a fundamentally different mindset is needed when you're a trustee on a board as there might be working in a business. And what we see is that distinction is often not well understood. So charities are often misunderstood even by the trustees who oversee them. I often see trustees who come from very large corporate backgrounds coming into the sector with a lot of misunderstandings about what sector is, and often bringing these very commercial, profit-focused mindsets with them that actually need to be fundamentally shifted to work effectively as a trustee. So what is the governing document? Now, you might call this a different thing in your organization. You might call it the Mem and Arts. You might call it the Constitution, the fundamental document that established you as a charity. So this is what gets sent to the Charity Commission, and they give you permission to register as a charity. It also sets out your rules, processes, and purpose. And you can only make changes to your constitution in accordance with what its own terms say. So that might mean bringing in members to make a vote. In some cases, such as where you're changing the objects, you might need to get the approval of the Charity Commission. So it's a really, really fundamentally important document that all trustees should be familiar with. Now, trustees, we've just said, trustees are responsible for the general oversight of a charity. But if we say trustees, we are covering people like people who are on the board at Oxfam with tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds of money in turnover, to say a local scout association that might make £1,500 income per year. So asking the question of where the trustee role begins and ends is quite a difficult one, because in different situations, trustees will do very different things. Just over the weekend, I was doing a governance review up at a mosque, which is a registered charity. It has 3 trustees. It has some staff, but it has no CEO. So the trustees are very operationally involved in running that organization. You wouldn't see Oxfam trustees doing the same thing. Now, this doesn't mean these trustees are wrong. It just means that the operational line is at a different level. Of course, there are hundreds of charities, thousands of charities in this country that have no staff at all. And of course, all the work is done by trustees. So the fundamental question is, what is the ultimate trustee role? Where does it begin and end? So as I've said, it can be different operationally, but there is a way in which the role is the same. And that comes down to the trustee duties. The trustee duties cannot be delegated. You can delegate tasks around the duties, whether that's to paid staff, whether that's to other volunteers, but the duties themselves always remain with you, whether you are trustee of a tiny charity with no staff or whether you are the trustee at Oxfam. You retain that overall responsibility for satisfying your duties. So there are 2 different ways to learn the duties. I always teach the 3 duties because I can remember 3 things off the top of my head: the duty of compliance, the duty of prudence, and the duty of care. We will go into these in greater detail in a moment. But if you've done training in some other places, they like to talk about 6 duties. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, except I just think all trustees should be able to remember the duties off the top of their head. And if you actually look at each of the duties, you can see that they all fall within the 3 duties anyway. So as far as I'm concerned, if people have the 3 duties in their head and they understand what it covers, then you're doing okay, and that's good enough. So going through each duty, so there's the duty of compliance. This is all about making sure you comply with things like your governing document, charity law, other laws. So things like if you were employing someone, that you're meeting HR law, or if you've got people coming onto an area, that you're meeting health and safety requirements. And it's also about acting with integrity, avoiding conflicts of interest or misuse of funds. So it's all about being compliant. It kind of makes sense with the word. It's also covering things like you must not be paid. Now, there's limited exceptions to that, as I said before, but it's probably better not to get into that because they're so rare. You can't be employed by the charity. There's a process you can go through if you want to apply for a role with a charity, but it does require commission approval. And you must not benefit from your position. So that, again, falls under the duty of compliance. We then have conflicts of interest, which I mentioned within the duty of compliance. So the question with conflicts of interest, is the trustee material benefiting from the conflict? If they're not, then you make sure there's procedures in place to manage that conflict. If you have those procedures, you follow them. If you don't, you put them into place. And then you report any benefit in your annual report. So you say, this is what's going on, this is the benefit that's happened, and this is how we've managed it. It's all about transparency. If there is a material benefit from the conflict, then you look at whether it's authorized. Does the governing document allow this to happen? Does the Charities Act allow it to be happening? Does the Charity Commission allow it to be happening? If it is, again, that's okay. You report the benefit in the annual report. If it's not, you either don't do it, the person needs to step down, or you have to apply to the Charity Commission for approval and authority to have that benefit. And of course, if they give that authority, then you report the benefit in the annual report. Now, I have a rule for managing non-material conflicts of interest. So there are situations in which people may not realize something is looking dodgy. So I always say, imagine someone is out to get your charity. They might have an ideological problem with your cause. They might have been closely involved and they don't like what recent decisions have been happening, or they might have been ousted from the organization, or they might be keyboard warriors jumping on a bandwagon. The reality is the charity sector is a highly emotional place. So you imagine this person called Larry who is thinking, what can I do to get at this organization? And you look at the situation and you think, would Larry be able to use this situation as ammunition against your charity? Could Larry paint your charity in a negative light if people heard about it from him and didn't know all the facts? And how dodgy would it sound to our supporters if this got out through people like Larry? So if you start thinking with this kind of mentality, then you might start getting some doubts about what's going on. So you always make sure that those with a possible conflict are excluded from decisions or meeting discussions. And you declare it everywhere. Transparency is the cure for situations looking dodgy, so you record it in minutes, in annual reports. Anywhere else, it might be necessary to record it. And also seeking advice when you need it. Now, that might be legal advice, or it might be advice from a consultant to help you navigate through this situation. So I say use the Larry lens. One of the common mistakes I see is trustees assuming that people will see that they've got good intentions, that they think things are, why would anyone think bad things of us? But actually, I see this happen time and again where there is this negative intention towards a charity, and trustees can get into difficulties when they're trying to manage it. Moving on to the second duty, this is the duty of prudence. So again, you think prudence, kind of prudential, you're thinking about funds and finances primarily. So it's about ensuring solvency, using charitable funds only to further the objects. It's a really important limitation. You can only use them to further the objects and powers associated with furthering the objects. It's avoid risking the charity's endowment funds, assets, or reputation. So obviously, reputation element is going beyond the finances. Being careful when investing or borrowing, ensuring income is spent within a reasonable time and fairly. And it's also about acting reasonably, prioritizing the charity's interests, not allowing personal views or prejudices to affect their conduct as trustees. Now, conflicts of interest come up here again, because I think conflicts of interest is related to a number of different duties. And also about adequately overseeing financial procedures and ensuring tax relief, so things like gift aid, is claimed. Then the third duty we've got is the duty of care. So this is about using reasonable care and skill, including your personal skills and experience, to run the charity. It's about accessing external professional advice when you need it. And it's about giving enough time, thought, and energy to the role. One of the things I like to say is, if you don't have time to read the papers, you don't have time to be a trustee. You need to be coming to meetings, having read papers, being prepared, having thought things through, and being ready to discuss the issues. It's also about meeting as often as needed, which can get complicated in situations of crisis when people might need to meet more often. Hopefully that's not something that you've all had to deal with, but I have as a trustee, and it did get to the point where I actually couldn't maintain the trustee role because it became too much time was needed. But as a trustee, you do have that duty. It's also about identifying risks, reporting serious incidents, and setting and managing strategic aims. Now, we're going to apply these in just a second, so I hope everyone's taking all of this on board. There's a should in the duty of care rather than a must, so it's about being up to date in the operating environment for your charity, trying to collaborate with other charities, and ensuring that you're environmentally responsible. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do an activity on breached duties. So we've got a case study, and then once we've done the case study, I am going to stop sharing for a moment. Whoops. And I'm going to show you a Zoom poll. And I want you to choose which of the duties you think each of the trustees in this case study have breached. So I think you'll be able to choose more than one if you want to, because some of them will have broken more than one duty, but have a look at it. So this is not a real charity. It is inspired by people I have met before, but some of the stories are quite exaggerated. So don't worry, these are real people. So Give a Fret is a charity that raises money for children to learn to play musical instruments. It has a board of 8 trustees. So the first trustee, Mike. So as I'm reading this, just have a think as to which duties you think Mike has breached. I will stop sharing in a moment and then I will launch the poll. So Mike is chair and also the local councillor for the area. He gives a lot of time to the charity, so has started charging for the hours when he has to come into the office. He has support from the charity administrator, Jack, who has just left high school and hasn't worked for a charity before. Because Mike is so busy, he has delegated responsibility to the administrator for reporting to the charity commission. Mike doesn't know it, but Jack doesn't have the login details, and it's now been more than a year since reports have gone in. Okay, I'm going to end it there, but we've got so almost, we've got lots of people have chosen duty of compliance. We've got quite a lot of duty of care, and we've got some duty of prudence. So you can see the results that have come up there. Now, primarily on Mike, I would say he's breached the compliance rule because we assume by being paid, he's broken the rule about trustees not being paid. That shouldn't be allowed. There's also a breach of duty of care because he talks about not having enough time. Now, if he doesn't have enough time to be a trustee, he shouldn't really be a trustee. And also there's that question, there's also the compliance question around reports. So Jack should have submitted the reports. Now, while that is Jack's delegated job to do that, obviously it remains with Mike and the rest of the board. So in this sense, the whole board is actually breaching their compliance duty there. And the other thing is about duty of care in terms of thinking about whether the person he's delegated to actually has the skills and ability to do the role that he had. So that is Mike. Let's meet the next person. Right, we've now got Susanna. Susanna is a paid member of staff who also sits on the board. She's particularly interested in the pay reviews each year and now takes charge of the pay review process. So what do you think, in terms of duties, Susanna has breached? So yeah, this is majority around compliance and prudence. Now, obviously, I mentioned conflicts of interest in both of those. This is a massive conflict of interest. Obviously, we have a compliance issue because you can't sit on the board and have a vote and be a paid member of staff unless they have a very unusual constitution that allows that to happen. I'm assuming that they don't because that would be really unusual, but it has happened before. I have come across organizations that have it, but we're going to assume she's not. But even if she was allowed to sit on the board, there is no way she'd be allowed to be considering her own pay review because that is super dodgy and a breach of prudence and compliance there. Okay, so now we're going to go back. We're going to meet the next member of this board, who is Orla. Orla's a trustee who lives in Canada. She works as a charity lawyer for a boutique firm in Toronto. She sends a monthly donation to the charity, but can never make meetings due to the time difference and her work schedule. So what duties do you think that Orla is breaching? So the majority got on this one. It's mainly duty of care for Orla because it's about giving both enough time to the role. Obviously, she's not giving any time to the role, but also she's not giving her skills to the role as well. This is clearly an organization that could do with a charity lawyer, even if she might be specialized in the Canadian sense. She should be giving her professional skills, and this organization isn't meeting its requirements in lots of ways. Obviously, she's still responsible for things like the compliance and prudence breaches of Mike. So you're not wrong, those who chose that one, because obviously there's the collective responsibility around that. And then we've got John. John is a retiree. He's also a trustee, but who's very interested in helping the charity to make more money. He's been really supportive and always gets a crowd of people to come to the charity's fundraising events. So far, so good. But he's also started running his own events under the charity's name, and he takes out his expenses before making the donation to the charity so he can add gift aid. When he was in business, he worked as a builder. He's having some challenges with the fundraising manager, who he feels is a bureaucrat who's always worrying about receipts and risk assessments. John is also Jack's grandfather. So quite a bit of different things in there. What do you think in terms of the areas where he might be in breach? And this one, yeah, duty of compliance and duty of prudence are the two that I would probably highlight most. So there are rules around financial, for the management of financial information, things like claiming gift aid. You've got to do it in the right way. There's also a whole other issue around here, which I haven't spoken about, which really comes under the Code of Fundraising Practice, which is about on behalf of charity fundraising events and in aid of charity fundraising events. And it's really important in your charity that you're really clear when you're raising money for something or when you're raising money just on behalf of the charity. So my example would be if my daughter, who's 13, decides to have a bake sale outside school to raise money for Macmillan, and someone buys a cake and they get food poisoning, they're never going to sue Macmillan because they've got food poisoning. They understand that what we did was in aid of Macmillan and that we were responsible for it. If, however, I'm as a CEO of a charity and I'm, running a ball and I put the logo on everything and I'm, the charity seems to be heavily involved, it's going to be assumed that that's an on behalf of situation. So if someone slips on the floor in some spilled apple juice, then the charity might end up facing the consequences for that. So where the problem is here is also that he's running events under the charity's name, which are on behalf of events without actually following the rules of the charity. So something we hadn't discussed before, but obviously something that would be really problematic if that was happening at your organization. So in terms of takeaways, it's really being really clear when you have events, whether it's in aid of or on behalf of, and who's taking the responsibility if something goes wrong. Obviously, we've also got the conflict of interest question. Now, we don't know enough about that. It may have all been declared. He may have had nothing to do with the appointment of his grandson, but it would raise, certainly the Larry lens might come up and you'd want to make sure that that was transparent. So obviously that's compliance and prudence there as well. Now we have Imran. I kind of love Imran. He's my favorite. Imran is a trustee. He works at a local bank. He's very keen on the investment market and has taken on the role of treasurer. On his advice, the charity has loaned some of its reserves to another charity that is working on supporting stray cats. Imran advised the board that the charity was so desperate for money, they offered him 7% on their investment. So what do you think might be the problems there with Imran? Great. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Yeah, absolutely. With this one, it's prudence and compliance again. So you've got to take care when investing. So investing in another charity is not a really sensible place to put your money. Charities don't make a profit, as we talked about earlier. So how are they possibly going to pay back such a high level of investment? And also there's a compliance question around you can only spend money to further the object. Now, while you are able to invest money in an organization to make money, but you wouldn't be investing in a charity that has a completely different object to you. You would be investing in a respected investment firm or bank account to do that. So I think you could also argue there is a duty of care there because he's just being utterly ridiculous with what he's suggesting and is not. We don't know what his skills are. We say he works at a bank. Now, if he does actually work in any kind of banking within the bank, we would definitely see a duty of care with his skills and experience should be applied to this particular question. So then we had 3 other trustees tend to remain silent during board meetings. One spends most of the time texting on her phone. I have unfortunately worked with board members who do this. Another is never saying the wrong thing, says nothing. And the third joined to improve his English, but rarely follows the conversation. So what we have there is pretty much a breach of all of them, really, because they're not doing any of the responsibilities of being a trustee. So thank you all very much for that. That was great. And we'll move on to the next module, which is talking about trustee recruitment challenges and techniques. I'm just going to double check before I did that. I've not had anything come through. Great. Okay. We're going to be using the chat for some of this one. But we're going to just start off with pop in the chat the biggest challenges you face in recruiting new trustees. So I'm going to stop share so I can actually see everything. But if you want to just pop into the chat, the challenges you might have in recruiting new trustees. I read a post on LinkedIn the other day from the CEO of Reach Volunteering, and I think she was saying something like 4 out of every 5 charities are reporting having a trustee vacancy. So suitable applications, yep. People are worried about legal responsibilities. I mean, I'm kind of almost encouraged when people are worried about the legal responsibilities because it shows that they're actually recognizing it's a serious job, and sometimes people don't. Interest, finding anyone with relevant skills, finding the right people, people's time and commitment, yep, skills. People have the skills we could use, don't have the time. Yeah. And it's interesting because, of course, we've seen, there's a lot of movement to kind of bring in younger trustees. But then, of course, then you struggle with things like full-time work and childcare and all of those kind of things as well. Suitable applicants, time commitment, perceived responsibilities. We haven't had a problem. Oh, that's brilliant. Who wrote that? That's a great sign. Finding someone who's social media savvy. It's interesting. Digital trustees generally seem to be an area that, I think every board needs a digital trustee. I think every charity needs digital expertise. And it's one of the areas I've really struggled with. There is an organization, is it called Digital Candle? I think it's called. They sometimes provide volunteers for different things, but I'm not sure if they do trustees. Skills. Trustees were worried about losing their house in case of a problem. Yes, I personally would never join a board that was an unincorporated association. I wouldn't be willing to take the risk. And that's with all of the background I have in like crisis and turning charities around and everything. I just wouldn't go near a charity that wasn't incorporated. So yeah, I completely understand that one. No one wants the responsibilities. I've definitely seen since COVID, it feels like it's harder to get people to volunteer than it used to be. I think people just want to hang around at home. Finding trustees from diverse backgrounds, absolutely. We're going to be talking about diverse thinking later on. There are some, if you're looking at, obviously diversity means lots of different things, which we'll talk about later. There is obviously the Young Trustees movement, if you're not familiar with it. And there's also Malcolm John, I think it's like I'm trying to think what it's called. Action for Trustee Diversity or Racial Diversity. I'm trying to think. His name's Malcolm John, though. But if you Google him, he runs an organization that's about getting different ethnic minority groups onto boards. And he's doing a lot of amazing stuff. Retired and don't want responsibility. People don't want responsibility. Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of things. Oh, yes, we've just put the link to the Young Trustees movement is up. Hoping Rachel's going to be able to find the other organization I just mentioned that I got the name wrong and I can only remember the CEO or the board chair. Fab. Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to go back to the presentation and we're going to talk a bit about best practice in recruitment. And I realize that sometimes this kind of thing can be a little irritating because it's easy to talk about best practice and difficult to actually get always meet best practice. So, right. So ways that aren't considered very effective to recruit a trustee. Ask someone you know already. Now, I say that probably knowing, I imagine everyone in this room and myself have done that before, because sometimes it's the only way to get a person on a board when you really need someone and they know you and they're willing to take that punt. But ideally, you want to be bringing on people you don't know. So I put that one on straight up to be like, I know this is a little hypocritical for me to say it, but there it is. Another way that you don't want to recruit is from a pool of skills and experiences that you already have on the board. Now, a lot of the comments that you just talked about were talking about getting diverse skills and getting skills that you don't have. So that's great that you're thinking about those things. I've worked in boards where, there's been, say, 9 out of 11 people who all have pretty much the same background, the same age group, the same demographic, everything. And you just don't get that kind of diversity of thought that you need. Focusing on professional skills, and I should have said alone rather than lived experience and diversity. I think it's really important to balance all of them because professional skills are super relevant and you don't bring someone in on a diversity characteristic on its own, but you need to be looking at your board as a whole and thinking about the skills and the lived experience and diversity that you don't have rather than just the skills question. And the other thing is to appoint because someone's willing and not hold interviews. I remember years ago, I'm not going to name which organization I was working at, but I said to a board that they should have interviews for a new treasurer. And a trustee who had proposed a new treasurer withdrew his nomination because he didn't want to subject his nominee to a beauty pageant, I think, as he put it. He was so opposed to the idea of holding interviews. Absolutely, trustees should be recruited on a merit-based process. So starting off with a skills and diversity audit to identify the gaps in your board is a really good way to start. And also having a board discussion, thinking about what barriers the board might have in place against people joining. That can be a really tricky thing to do if those barriers don't affect the people in the room. So it's being really creative sometimes and thinking, okay, who would be good who's not in the room? Why are they not in the room? Some of them might be because we have our board meetings at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, so people who work can't come. But it might also be, well, we send out 300 pages of papers before each board meeting, which is going to really exclude those who might have learning difficulties or might struggle with reading or might have sight difficulties, those kind of questions. So sometimes it requires a little bit of creative thinking to imagine where the barriers might be, because barriers that don't apply to us are always invisible. So having that conversation can be really interesting to uncover the barriers you don't know are there. Obviously, we've talked about balancing skills with lived experience and diversity. So balancing being that important question. Advertising widely and thoughtfully and targeting unrepresented groups actively as well. I'm doing a bit of I don't normally do recruitment, but I'm doing a bit of recruitment for an organization I've done some governance work with before. And I'm working with a woman who specializes in headhunting because I don't do that. But we've had to think really, really carefully about, in terms of where we're going to advertise, what's going to actually reach the people who aren't on the board, who the board needs. So it is a really thoughtful process to go through. I'm a big fan of Reach, by the way. Reach Volunteering is a great site because you can actually approach people as well. Also thinking about what the role offers to the applicant, be open to younger and less experienced trustees. I have to admit, the first time I worked with younger trustees, I was a bit prejudiced. I didn't think they'd be able to offer very much. And I was so impressed. These people were probably in their mid-20s and were absolutely brilliant trustees. But I definitely came in with a bit of, they're going to be a bit less able to contribute. And they really weren't. I was absolutely wrong. So that was really interesting. They're reviewing meeting arrangements so that all trustees are comfortable in participating. And again, that's something you should have open conversations about regularly, ideally. And be really careful when you're considering the time commitment. Now, I know a lot of you put in the chat that the time commitment has put people off. I actually think it's better that someone says they're not going to join the board because that's too much time than you say it's 4 meetings a year and then they find out it's more like, 3 or 4 times that amount of time. So it's really important to get that time estimation right. And be explicit about it. Drafting a role description, getting a range of people to read on it and comment on it to check for hidden bias. We all use language that works for our kind of people. And so being able to share that with different people and make sure you're not using language that kind of puts off different groups of people is really helpful. Having a panel, again, as diverse as you can to review applications and hold interviews. Ensuring your application process is merit-based, but also accessible. I worked with an organization once during a governance review, and it was really interesting because they had a very robust process. It was really professional, really merit-based. In that way, it looked really amazing. But actually, some of the feedback from trustees was that if I hadn't been in formal interviews before, I would have been really put off by this process. It was too much. It was too intimidating. And actually, if you're trying to get people of different backgrounds to join the board, this is not actually a great way to do it. So that was quite an interesting process to go through. And also checking references, just like you would for a job. I think sometimes people are a bit nervous to do that, but it's such an important role. You can't, in a lot of cases, you can't remove trustees once you've appointed them. So making sure that you're doing that process is really important. One of the things that comes up a lot is around service user involvement. I think you call them participants in your organization. So involving them in boards themselves. And I think a lot of RDA boards have service users involved. It really varies organization to organization. It can be notoriously challenging, but there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And it's always important to make sure that someone is not appointed solely from that service user perspective and not supported and expected to do the other elements of the trustee role. They have to have the ability to oversee the charity's financial and operational delivery, and supported. If they don't have those skills immediately, but they can learn them, then absolutely supported to get there. So it's not one of those things that I just want to say everyone should have service users on the board, but it is excellent practice to do that if you can. But I want to reflect and recognize that that's not always as easy as I might say. Some organizations I've worked with have had service users where actually joining the board hasn't been right for the service users for various reasons, but they can participate in other groups like advisory groups and forums that perhaps are more informal. They don't have the legal responsibility, or they may not have the longer term commitment to being involved in the organization, which has worked for some organizations. Obviously, it really depends on how your participants, where they're at as in their lives. Now we're going to talk about inducting a trustee. Now, all of these are things I've actually seen before. So 3 ways to not to induct a trustee. Welcome. The board meeting is tomorrow. You'll figure it out as you go along. The Charity Commission has some stuff available. Just find it out yourself. And so give them no reading or overwhelm them with reading all in one go. So that is 3 really common ways that people induct trustees. And I can tell you it doesn't really achieve a lot. Somebody said, what do you mean by service users? So beneficiaries, participants, the people who come and use your charitable services. Sorry, I didn't see that when it first came through. I tend to use service users as a general phrase. I think there's a whole debate in the sector about what's the right phrase to use. Increasingly, the word beneficiaries is being seen as quite, I guess, Victorian, like it's something that's done to someone. There are other languages that people use where they're trying to be more active. Service users is quite a neutral thing because all it means is someone who uses the service that you provide, but there are criticisms of that word as well. So I'm yet to have a word provided to me that kind of ticks all the boxes for all different organizations. So if you don't like the word service user, you're not alone. So to induct a trustee, I always think a process that takes at least 6 months is a good one. It gives them time. So you start with what they need to know and then you build on that. There's so much information to get across. I really strongly believe, and you might think, and probably fairly, that I'm really biased on this because I deliver governance training, but I think all trustees should attend governance training. There's lots of generic stuff out there that they can go to alone. Places like NCVO and DSC have online training available. But I also think the whole board should be having training together annually and biannually, both to learn what's happening in the world around them, but also to build it themselves up as a board to develop their governance and their best practice. I also think induction needs to cover both the specifics of the charity, which most inductions do, to be fair, but also the general role. A lot of trustees come in and they don't get given anything about things like their duties. They might be given the essential trustee document that the Charity Commission publishes, but that might be it. So just making sure that, there's no assumption that anything is known. And so you're starting from the beginning. And I think there should also be that sense of ongoing trustee development. So, for example, a lot of trustees struggle with financial oversight. And what tends to happen in some organizations is somebody goes, oh, well, we've got an accountant who's the treasurer. So they do all of the financial stuff. But actually, all trustees need to be confident enough to look at the financials and be able to ask relevant questions. So there is development out there. There's finance for non-finance trustee training that's available widely. So those kind of questions should be connected in to the induction process. Right. So we're going to actually get into groups now. You get to have a chance to talk because I've been talking for more than an hour. Actually, not more than an hour, nearly an hour. So I'm going to put you into small groups and I want you to have a chat about just ideas, bounce some ideas around about what you could do differently at charity to recruit trustees, or for that person who said you had no problems. What has worked really well for you? Just sharing your challenges, sharing your recommendations. And when you come back, I'm going to ask you all to put your ideas into the chat so we can all learn from them together. So breakout rooms. Okay, how many people have we got at the moment? We have about 40, right? Okay, so we're going to do about 8 breakout rooms then, I think. Okay, I'm going to create those rooms. I'm assuming everyone's okay to go. You all know what you're doing. Obviously, you'll be able to unmute when you get in there and actually speak for a little while. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, so we'll come back at about past. But what'll happen is when it's time to come back, I'll send I'll close them and you'll get 60 seconds before it closes. Okay, here we go. Challenge of diversifying your group outside your volunteer participant community. Yeah. Main discussion was around the lack of diversity of trustees. Volunteers, coaching, trustee, training trustee, the same person. About this thing, a lot of consistency. There are a lot of trustees from within the volunteer groups. The need for defined roles and responsibilities and advertising for those skills. We recruit the wrong way. Reach sounds very positive. Reach is great, and if you're, if you're a small charity, it's actually free as well. And so, what you can do, what I really like with Reach, is you can put it on there, put your advert up, and then you can actually see all the volunteers who've registered with Reach, and you can approach them and ask them to apply. And that has brought in some really good trustees who we never would have come across in different organizations that I've worked at. So, it's definitely worth checking out.
A link in the chat. So one of our groups at the moment, Scropton, they do use Reach already. So I've linked an example of their advertisement. They're currently looking for a treasurer. So that might be helpful for people to have a little look at. But some of our groups are already using that. So if you want to kind of talk to them about their experiences, they'd be more than happy to do so.
Great. And I think it's free up to £1 million turnover. So which covers the vast majority of charities in this country. So numbers on committees, great hearing the experience from other groups, need to clear on the time commitment. Possibly varies on the size. I think this is one of the challenges is actually even trustees in one charity might have a different amount of time that they spend, depending on their own availability as well, which can be tricky. And you have 5 word of mouth. Yes, I think this is the thing about word of mouth. It can be really useful. It's just it doesn't always overcome those diversity challenges that we have. So I think the worst is the tap on the shoulder to this exact same kind of person. Like I mentioned, that charity I worked with, where they all had the same background and the same demographics and everything, and they were an appalling board, which is why I'm not going to actually mention which organization it was. Yeah, I think if you I've seen the tap on the shoulder thing work where it's been, I need someone really different and I know someone through this avenue. But just generally, I think a merit-based recruitment process is, more professional. Small groups that don't own horses probably don't have as big a problem as large ones. All trustees need to be invested. The importance of separating the role of trustee and operational roles, absolutely, that is so important because what tends to happen, I often say, if you're looking down, which is what operations is, you're not looking up, which is what trustees are doing. So if you have 2 different roles, you've really got to think of them as 2 different hats and separate the 2 of them. The same thing happens when you have trustees in larger organizations where they come in and volunteer for the cause as well. Need more other people. Yeah, it sounds like there's some really good conversation, which is great because I'm sure you are all desperate to not just sit there and listen to me talking too quickly. So we do have to go back into the next bit of me talking a lot. But thank you all for those shared ideas and approaches. That's really fantastic. So what we're going to go into now is this whole diversity and groupthink kind of work. Right. So the value and challenges of diverse decision making. And now we've just talked about how it can be really hard to get diversity, but we're going to start off talking about what is diversity. And I think what's really interesting is when I work with charities, when I say diversity, what tends to happen is or up to 3 things pop into people's mind: gender, age, and race. And that's kind of the be all and end all of what people tend to think about. But diversity is a really complex, diverse concept. So things like demographic or identity diversity. So that is things like gender, race, and age, but also all the other protected characteristics that in the Equal Rights Act. So disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, maternity, marriage or civil partnership. They're all covered in that first one. But you've then got other types of diversity as well. You've got cognitive diversity, which is things like your experiences, your insights, your perspective, and your thinking styles. I'm a Myers-Briggs facilitator. There's a lot of stuff we talk about there in different ways that people process information, come to decisions, that kind of thing. And then we've got lived experience diversity. So this isn't just, I think people tend to use lived experience to mean experience that's relevant to the charity's cause. But actually, it can be things like socioeconomic experience. It can be work experience. It can be your skill set. The experience we all have to this point in our lives is our lived experience, and it will differ with the different lives that we've lived. So just really coming at diversity with a much broader approach is a really good way to start. Why is diversity important? Well, individuals bring different experiences and perspectives which contribute to better decision making. And groups of similar individuals tend to have the same biases, the same heuristics, and they tend to make decisions that are less likely to be the best decision. And it's really important to recognize that even groups of highly intelligent people can make what are called unintelligent groups. Now, this concept of unintelligent groups comes from this brilliant book called Rebel Ideas. I don't know if you've read this one. I mention a few other books later on in the piece, but it's a really interesting idea. So when you think about groups of people, now if you imagine each of these squares is a group, and each of these circles are people with different diverse backgrounds and experiences. So what you want in your group is a range of different people who have different experiences, different diverse characteristics, different perspectives, different ways of looking at the world, so that you fill that group with lots and lots of different ways of doing things. You might have each of these circles is a person who's a very, very highly intelligent person, but very similar to each other. They might share the same identity demographics. They might have had similar work experiences. So that board I've mentioned a couple of times very much was a group filled with people who were like this. And you can see, because they've got such similar backgrounds and experiences, the way they approach questions are going to be really similar. So you get a lot less breadth and perspectives when you bring a group together that looks like that. And so I think that it's important, I said this before, but even highly intelligent people can make unintelligent groups. Now, I don't know if anyone's seen this. There's a very funny song that's called 100 Tampons. If you want to Google it afterwards, it's on YouTube. It's done by a comedian singing about in 1983 when Sally Ride, the first woman who was going to space, apparently a group of rocket scientists came to her and they asked her if 100 tampons would be the right amount for her to take for a 6-day trip to space. Have a look at the song. It's very funny. It is a slight twisting of the actual reality of what happened. I believe that it was an offer rather than an actual thing that happened. But I think it's a really great example of the fact that literally rocket scientists, really, really intelligent people who actually together did not make an intelligent group when they came together to come up with this decision. And you think, what would have made a better group in that situation? Maybe having a woman in the room, maybe having someone who actually understood, maybe somebody who'd lived with a woman, someone who had any kind of interaction with women before. That would have brought in a different perspective that maybe would not have resulted in an embarrassing kind of situation like that. But it's a really funny song and it's definitely worth a look if you've got a spare few minutes at some point. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I'm going to talk a bit more about it, but these are some of the books that I've been reading in the recent year or so. Thinking Fast and Slow, it's brilliant, talks a lot about heuristics, and it actually kind of demonstrates some of them by making you think about them first and you fall into the trap. Predictably Irrational, Rebel Ideas, which is the one I held up before, and The Wisdom of Crowds. Really fascinating. The more I read, the more I just think this stuff is really eye-opening. So really, and they're really readable. I mean, I think especially, both Thinking Fast and Slow and Rebel Ideas are incredibly accessible and readable books. Right. So what are all these things that we're talking about? We're talking about group biases, group decision-making. So cognitive biases and decision-making. Some of them include confirmation bias, which is, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these, if not all of them, but it's the tendency to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms pre-existing beliefs. Anchoring bias, we see this a lot in bargaining. It's when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered. So if we're thinking about how much something is worth, the first value that we hear becomes the thing that we tend to think there is a value that the final value should be based around. Availability heuristic, this is about making decisions on the information that's available rather than all relevant information. When we look at biases, we've got things. So groupthink is an idea, this kind of, in any group, we have this desire for harmony. We want everybody to get on. We want to conform. It's a really natural human instinct to conform. And so what tends to happen is that this desire for harmony leads to dysfunctional decision making. And so social proof is part of these group dynamics. So it's following the actions of others, going with the majority opinion. I see it a lot with certain more kind of persuasive trustees, or those with a stronger kind of influence on a group can really influence where everyone else is going. And shared mental maps, these are kind of these unspoken group rules and assumptions, which are really interesting because they're often really hidden to those who hold them, but they can be really exclusionary to those who don't. So one example for this is actually what I think of as kind of, especially the southern half of England, politeness norms. Now, I'm from Australia originally, and it's quite different socially there. We're a lot more direct. We tend to be more kind of upfront and friendly in our engagement. Whereas in the part of the UK that I've lived in since I moved here nearly 20 years ago, there's a lot of rules around kind of politeness behavior and polite interactions. And sometimes those rules can be shared and be very, very strong, but also be invisible to those who hold them. And I actually did a governance review with an organization where I would say that the level of politeness being upheld was very much a shared mental map. The board had come from a very similar background, and they held this politeness to the point where they didn't want to challenge each other because they felt that challenging each other's ideas was actually insulting the person who had that idea. And I talked about this in my governance review, and they did take it on. They were quite confused by the idea that politeness could be a bad thing. But when I shared it and talked more about it, they were kind of like, oh, okay. But I think one of the things that you see then happen is when a more diverse group is built, so you get people from outside that particular shared mental map coming into the group, they then breach the politeness norms. And so those in the group can react even unconsciously to the breach of these norms, and those outside who've come in then don't feel like they belong. So I see a lot of the time people coming in, joining boards who are, people who are joining who are different from the boards who've been there before, and they don't stay. And one of the reasons they don't stay and they don't contribute and they don't become part of things is because of these shared mental maps. So being aware of them is really fundamentally important. So we look at, heuristics and biases and risk and value perceptions. We've got things like loss aversion. So this fear we have of loss is psychologically more powerful than the pleasure of equivalent gains. One of the ways I see this is actually, so my cough lozenge is getting in the way. Is actually where charities have faced are reaching the point where they need to close or where they need to reduce services, they need to shut down on certain things that they're doing. There can be such a fear of loss aversion that actually organizations can end up completely crashing because they don't recognize that it's important to take these steps. There's also overconfidence bias, so overestimating one's skills, the knowledge of the accuracy of information that you have. And the sunk cost fallacy, another thing that I see a lot of charities doing. So continuing a project based on what's already been invested in it. And sometimes it can be very hard and painful, but actually because we have all of these biases and fallacies and heuristics at play, we have to really catch ourselves when we're doing them. And I've run 7 charities, but over 8 leadership appointments. Now, more than half of those have been in severe crisis, and in all of them, I've seen these kind of things have affected the reason why that organization has gotten into crisis, because action wasn't taken early. People weren't testing and really interrogating the decisions and the information they were looking at. So it really does have a big impact. This is a section from Matthew Syed's Rebel Ideas. Now, he talks about, just above this bit, he's talking about heterogeneous teams, so teams with people who are really different, and the fact that they found that actually making decisions was difficult. It was hard. It was, not talking about conflict, but certainly disagreement and debate and discomfort. But actually that the decisions made were really excellent decisions. Those teams that were homogenous, people who were the same, had a much more agreeable experience. And that's because they spent their time agreeing. They were mirroring each other's perspectives, and they were more likely to be wrong, but they were far more confident about being right. They weren't challenged on their blind spots. They didn't get a chance to see them. They weren't exposed to other perspectives. So they became more certain of their own. And this is the danger with homogenous groups. They're more likely to form judgments that combine excessive confidence with grave error. This is something, again, in a lot of my governance reviews, I find. I have boards very proudly tell me that there's little to no disagreement on the board, that decisions are reached easily, that they always achieve consensus, and they very rarely have to go to a vote. And I think they're often surprised when I respond back saying, well, that's a really bad sign. We need to see debate. We need to see disagreement to be confident that you're making the right decisions. That's the kind of thing we need to be seeing happening in board meetings. And that is inherently uncomfortable. And I think the way that boards have to overcome that discomfort is by building trust, spending that time together, and, talking openly about some of these things to make sure that everyone's on the same page about, the value of the decision that they're trying to reach. So highly skilled and intelligent groups of people can make big mistakes without diversity. Some examples. So he talked about some of been the internet. I'm just getting signs saying my internet connection is unstable. I hope that I'm still coming through. But because they all shared very similar identity demographics. They had similar life experiences. They were very similar in their background. And as a result, obviously we know what happened there. NASA and the Challenger disaster. In that situation, we saw examples of sunk cost fallacy, optimism and availability bias, and groupthink, where NASA leadership actually ignored warnings from engineers about the risks posed by faulty O-rings in cold temperatures. Obviously, the results of that were catastrophic, but it was an example of these kind of bad group decision making. Bay of Pigs invasion, the US's failed invasion of Cuba, where they expected Cuban exiles to rise against Fidel Castro. The advisors of the president had similar backgrounds, had little dissent, were overconfident, and didn't challenge their flawed assumptions. So these are all big American examples, but we've got charities that experience this too. Now, Kids Company collapsed due to allegations of financial mismanagement and poor governance. And the charity was heavily reliant on public funding, and its spending was criticised for being unsustainable. The board was criticised at the time for lacking diverse voices, including individuals with financial expertise or from the charity sector. And this led to a failure to challenge the CEO's decision-making, particularly around financial risks and the sustainability of the organisation's model. Oxfam, you might remember the major scandal a few years back when Oxfam found that some of its staff had engaged in sexual misconduct while working in Haiti. The board was criticised for being too slow to address the issue and for its inadequate response once the allegations came to light. They lacked expertise in safeguarding, and with limited diversity in gender and cultural perspective, were seen as out of touch with how power dynamics in humanitarian settings could contribute to that kind of abuse. And I'm not sure if you'll remember the President's Club. The President's Club faced a public scandal that led to its closure following revelations of sexism, sexual harassment, and objectification of women at its annual fundraising event. And its 3 trustees, all white, wealthy businessmen, were heavily criticised for the event and its open misogyny. So charities returned previous donations, and the trustees stepped down from many other board roles that they held as well. It had a big ongoing consequence. So just, thinking to yourself, is your board demonstrating one or more of these behaviors? Now, they will be. I think that's the important thing. All groups do. Any group that spends time together for any length of time will start developing these group behaviors, but also individually, we all have these heuristics and biases. It's not a sign that there is something wrong with you if you do that. We all do it. I just spent 2 days at my MBA course a few weeks ago, doing a negotiation course where they were hammering home to us the importance of anchoring, the fact that you want to be the first one to make an offer because you want to anchor, you don't want the other side to anchor. So, this is something that you can't really avoid as a human being. So just having a think about what behaviors you can think about that maybe might bring up some of the things that we've just talked about. Just conscious of time. What I'm going to suggest is if you'd like to take a screenshot of this, if you can see it. I know my captions are still to the side here. But it's an activity for something for you to do at your next board meeting. Just thinking about a major decision and going through all these questions to think about, whether there are things that you can detect and maybe learnings that you can have. And obviously, if you can't find any evidence of bias or groupthink, you might need to get some external help to come in. It's sometimes easier for outsiders to see things. So what can you do? Some people can be really sensitive to the idea that they're not making decisions purely rationally, even though we all do it. And I think it's really important to recognize this is common to all of us. But if you do get met with defensiveness with your own board, what can you do? So the first thing is about raising the issue. So sharing information about the session, reading some of the books mentioned, they really are so interesting. And start referring openly to biases, heuristics, closed group dynamics, those kind of things. Start using that language and reference if you don't already. Really starting to observe your group dynamics. I've seen it before with the groupthink thing where something seems to be going in one direction, and then one powerful person says something, and you just watch the whole decision collapse. And sometimes as a CEO, that's been heartbreaking when you put a lot of work into a recommendation, and you think, "What just happened? That was the wrong decision." But thinking about things like when discussions are dominated by a few voices, does someone always say their opinion first? Does that affect what happens next? Do you leave open the idea for alternative views to be explored, or is the group really rushing to a decision? So really starting to take that step back and observing what's going on, not just participating in it. Clarifying questions can be a really good way to gently challenge. So you can ask open-ended questions like, could we be focusing too much on early information, which is the anchoring bias, or are there other viewpoints or data we haven't considered? What don't we know yet? So that's kind of overcoming that availability bias question. Encouraging critical thinking, framing the discussion to help identifying bias. So what evidence do we have for or against this decision? Are we taking or avoiding risks because of recent successes or failures? And you're really starting to kind of think about them and encouraging others to think more critically. And causing out biases diplomatically. Obviously, you don't want to go, you just did a availability bias, but thinking about respectfully and non-confrontationally. So I wonder if we might be anchoring on the first figure we saw. Could we revisit some other options? It seems like we're leaning towards the majority opinion, but why don't we spend some time on the minority views to make sure we fully considered all perspectives? Are we taking this view due to past investment, or is it still the best choice moving forward now? So thinking about each of these biases and fallacies and just thinking away, going, oh, could this be happening? Let's have a conversation about it. Acknowledge and balance. So trying to acknowledge valid points while steering the conversation. So I see concerns about risk. Could this be loss aversion at play? What's the potential upside? I think we're all assuming that this will work. Could we be relying on a shared belief about how things should work rather than considering alternative behaviors or solutions? Those kind of things. And really, it's always about fostering this environment where trustees feel comfortable challenging each other constructively and without fear of judgment. It's really, really important to have that, proper debate, proper engagement, no one being afraid to put an idea forward or to challenge someone else. And sometimes if something does feel too one-sided, maybe pausing to reflect or revisiting key decisions when this is happening. Other things you can do, maybe someone could act as devil's advocate if you've got a difficult decision. There's an activity you can do where you imagine a future where your decision turns out to be the wrong one, and you spend some time like, how did it go wrong? And why things didn't turn out. That can often help you figure out whether actually you've made the right decision or if you're ignoring things that you should be considering. And of course, we've talked about diversifying your board. So I'm just going to, because I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to stop sharing. And we've got a bit of time for Q&A. Oh, great. So I can see the things I've missed is that Rachel has shared the activity for everybody. If you want to download that from the chat, that's there for you to take back to your board. But yeah, we've got about 5 minutes or so for Q&A. So if anyone's got any questions or comments, anything they want to share, please do so. And I'll see if I can help. I don't know if questions are coming or the word heuristics is new. We had to Google. I think I learned it when I read Thinking Fast and Slow last year. So it was one of those things that I'd heard of some of these things like availability bias and anchoring, but I'd never actually read them. I'd never read them so in a way they all connected. And of course, each time I read a new book, I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. I actually got a pen when I was reading this one, and I kept on like making notes and underlining things, and it's just so good. It's so fascinating. Is there anything that anyone's sitting there thinking, you didn't cover this and I really wish you did, or I really disagree with something that you said? Because do feel free. You're allowed to disagree with me as well as me telling you to disagree with your board. You can disagree with me too. I realize it's nearly 9 o'clock, so it's also getting to that time of night where maybe everybody's looking forward to the cup of tea and television or something. I know I do. So Rachel's just asked, what are you going to take back today to your board? Is any thoughts people have got about things they might take back? Succession planning. Oh, succession planning. When I do governance reviews, I always feel a little reluctant to even mention succession planning because it is so hard to even keep a board populated, let alone thinking about who's going to be chair next and who's going to be, So it's great thing when an organization has that sorted, but it's hard. It is hard to do that right. The need to be more diverse. Yeah. I do think sometimes we have to think about the structure of the sector that we've been given, that it's come from a corporate world. The whole board structure, while it is different from the corporate structure, it is a kind of product of it, and that corporate world is not necessarily set up to be inclusive, and I think that's something that we as a charity sector need to grapple with, and think about how we can do things differently. I'm a big believer in you don't have to have a really formal meeting. You can have participatory decision making. Looking to reach, someone's mentioned. Yeah. Lots of ideas to get better discussion. Separate the operational issues. Yeah. In Scotland, all trustees must resign at the AGM. Really? So in Scotland, all trustees at all organisations have to resign each year? Is that, wow. Most, a lot of constitutions have a third of trustees have to resign each year, but that's, that really risks really lumpy recruitment processes, doesn't it? It also gives people an out. So if they go down every year, then they might go, yeah, I'm done now. Thinking about more onboarding of trustees, how to ensure everyone speaks out at meetings. Sometimes, yeah, judged on how quickly it finishes. Yes. Witnessed some of those scenarios before. Well, that's good. It's I mean, it's not good, but it's good people can see them. Obviously, we all have them. So participating on at meetings as trustees. Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your time. We've got how to make sure everyone can equal opportunities. Yes. I mean, one of the interesting things about the speaking at meetings is in Myers-Briggs, we talk about people with introversion and extroversion preferences. And you'll find extroversion preferences people are happy to kind of like put half-baked ideas out there and they want to bounce stuff around. And introversion preference people often want to really thought about stuff and then come up with a kind of a proper concept before they share. And one of the ways to, overcome that when I do away days is, provide questions in advance. So if somebody wants to think about it first, they can, but the extroversion people can still come and bounce things around if they want to. So, sometimes thinking about what questions might be posed beforehand and, what information is provided in advance to get the best out of everybody. Brilliant. Well, that brings us to 9:00. So, thank you all so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate you turning up on this cool autumn evening and spending your time with me this Trustees Week. So happy Trustees Week. I hope you have a lovely rest of the week and I hope there's more celebrations for trustees around where you are. And I think that's our session done. So thank you all so much.